Hey guys, thanks for joining back in our Philippians study. This has been a way that I think it would be helpful for us to stay connected to Scripture and try to stay connected together as a church, kind of working through the same book together throughout the week. This is one of Paul's prison letters. We sort of did an introduction last week. And my thought for this is just to make this study as, from my end, as fundamental and practical as possible. And so, as I was reading through the text this week and kind of going through a couple of the lessons and doing the readings that I'm doing in this course, I saw 5 things about the gospel that I want to share, and I'll follow it up with some discussion questions after I send the video. So first, I just want to read the text. It's Philippians chapter 1, beginning in verse 12, and then through the end of the chapter. So Philippians chapter 1, beginning verse 12. It says, "I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance, as it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. Yet, which I shall choose I cannot tell, for I am hard-pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith, so that in me you may have ample cause to glory in Christ Jesus because of my coming to you again. Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and not frightened in anything by your opponents. This is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God. For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake, engaged in the same conflict that you saw I had, and now hear that I still have." So I said that I just saw 5 things about the gospel here that Paul's sort of relaying and conveying to the church at Philippi. And the first thing that I saw here is just the basic idea that the gospel is the proclamation that Jesus died and rose from the dead and is reigning as King of the world. That's the gospel. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul lays out the gospel. And as I was reading through this, it's interesting to me that Paul says that the gospel has become known through the whole imperial guard. There he says in verse 12 and 13. It says the entire imperial guard has heard the gospel of Christ through him. And so you kind of ask the question, like, what does that mean? Like, what have they heard about? And my understanding is that they've heard exactly what we just said. They've heard that this person, Jesus, you can kind of imagine the imperial guard talking. There's this Jewish guy, Paul, who's been thrown into prison. They're saying, why has he been arrested? Why is he here? Oh, because he believes that this Jewish person named Jesus, who we crucified a while back, actually rose from the dead and is going around telling people that he is actually king of the world. That's what Jason and the others were accused of in Acts 17 when they were dragged out of Jason's house and they said, they're preaching that there's another king, not Caesar. That's kind of the offense here. And I just think it's important for us to have a firm understanding of just what the gospel in its most simple state is. It's the proclamation that Jesus died and rose from the dead and is reigning as king of the world. It's very unlikely that when Paul was in prison, when it says the gospel went through the entire imperial guard, it's very unlikely that every facet of Paul's theology went through the entire imperial guard, or that a very specific list of do's and don'ts went through the entire imperial guard. Not to say that those things aren't important, but those things are not synonymous with the gospel. Does that make, hopefully that makes sense. Like, the gospel is simply, like, when you in your life demonstrate that you believe that Jesus died and rose from the dead and that he's reigning as king of the world, you're proclaiming the gospel. That's fundamentally what it is. It doesn't mean you're right about everything, but it means you're right about the gospel. That's what it is. And so that's sort of the news. Tim Keller often says the gospel is good news. It's not good advice. It's the good news that Jesus is king. In the ancient world, the word gospel was a very royal kind of political statement. A new king would come into a city and he would proclaim the gospel. And to him, that was the good news that I'm your king now. Whether it actually was good news for the citizens of that city or that state or whatever. So the gospel it's kind of political. It's the idea that, hey, Jesus is king and we owe our allegiance to him as king first and foremost before we owe our allegiance to anything else. And so that's the first point, just the gospel in its most basic state. The second thing that I think is interesting about this is that for Paul, the gospel is not tribalistic. You notice here he says, some indeed are preaching Christ from envy and rivalry. He says some people are preaching it from a place of sincerity. They're actually wanting to promote Jesus. But he says some are preaching it from a perspective of rivalry with me. They're actually competing with me for, there's some ambiguity here. He doesn't specifically say who he's talking about. But you get the impression that there are people who are competing for maybe power in the church, like power within the realm of first century Christianity. And so they're going out and they're preaching the gospel, maybe trying to earn the status of apostle. They're sort of rivals with Paul. But what's interesting to me about that is Paul doesn't really attack those people. Like, he doesn't come in and say, so no one should listen to what they have to say. Paul says, yeah, they're preaching the gospel from an insincere place. It's coming from a place of envy and, it's not coming from the best place. But he says, like, when he says, what then? That's kind of Paul's way of saying, so what? I don't care. They're still preaching the gospel. So when they go out and they do that from a place of envy and rivalry, the net of that is that more people are hearing the good news that Jesus rose from the dead and is reigning as king. And so Paul doesn't approach it with the spirit of sort of tribalism. He doesn't say, watch out for these people. They're not with us. They're our enemies. They're against us. He says, yeah, I question their motives, but they're still preaching the gospel. And he says, as far as I'm concerned, that's a good thing. So he's able to sort of lay his pride. The gospel actually convicts Paul to lay his pride aside and to say, that's still a good thing, that those people are proclaiming that Jesus Christ is the Lord of the world and that he's king and that he's been raised from the dead. Paul doesn't have like a tribalistic approach to that. Those who he would typically consider to be outsiders because of their motives, he says, no, they're still proclaiming the gospel. And so I was kind of convicted by that in terms of the way that we view those who we may consider to be outsiders as the church. The third thing that I saw about this is that the gospel is evidence that God has chosen to work through things that would normally be considered shameful. We talk about this a lot, but I think it's hard for us to really grapple with the shamefulness and the humiliation of the cross. In the ancient Roman world, if you were crucified, you were taken outside of the city because you no longer had any worth or value or place in the city, in civilization. So you were taken outside the city. You were forsaken by everyone, friends, family, relatives, anyone. You were totally forsaken. You were stripped naked, and you were crucified and lifted up so that anyone who walked by sees your naked, suffering body on the cross and says, whatever that person did, I don't want to do that. That was the point of crucifixion. Otherwise, they would have just had you beheaded. But it was a display for others to see what happened to you, and so that they would be terrified of becoming enemies of the state themselves. So when you think about how long it took someone to die from crucifixion. I mean, oftentimes it would take hours or sometimes more than a day or two to actually for your life to be completely extinguished by crucifixion. Jesus suffered for a long time through the scourgings, the beatings, and then the actual crucifixion. And when you think about being stripped naked, you know, I think I've said this at NTC before, it's not a pretty image, but think about being stripped naked and then being crucified and it taking you hours and hours and possibly even a couple of days to finally die because of crucifixion. Most people who were hung on a cross, at some point during that time, they had to go to the bed, they defecated on themselves publicly. Can you imagine how humiliating that was? That's the Son of God who is actually experiencing that. So it's an incredibly shameful thing, but the beauty of the gospel is that God looks at something that's that just debased and humiliating and shameful, and he says, that's the thing that I'm actually going to choose to work for good. And because of the shame and the humiliation, on the other side of that is resurrection, which is what we're all celebrating right now with Easter. And so what's interesting about Paul's story in Philippians is he is sort of embodying the story of Jesus himself. He has taken on a place of shame and humiliation through imprisonment, which I talked about last week. It's really there might be some small differences, but it's not mind-blowing to us. The idea of imprisonment is a shameful and humiliating thing. No one would have went around waving a flag or a banner saying, I've been a prisoner. It's kind of a humiliating thing. Paul embraces it. He has taken on a status of shame and humiliation, but what does he say about it? He says, but God's working through that. Like resurrection is going to be the result of that. More people hearing the gospel is become the result of that. And so God's always choosing things that most people would look at and say, I don't want to be associated with that. It's humiliating. It's beneath me. But Paul says, no, God's actually, those are the things that he chooses. So when I find myself in a place like that in my life, the challenge is for me to say, these are the kinds of things that God chooses to work through. So maybe I should embrace it instead of running from it or being afraid of it. So that was sort of challenging to me as I worked through it. Kind of connected to that, the fourth point, the gospel is a commission. It's a challenge to us to enter into the story of God through the way we live. So the gospel is the thing that saves us. We talk about that a lot. But then the New Testament is pretty clear about the fact that the gospel, it not only saves us from our sins, which is critical, we have to have that, but at the exact same time, the gospel turns around to us and says, so now you have to enter into the story yourself, just like Paul's doing with his imprisonment. He says here towards the end of the chapter, he says, only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. That's verse 27. Let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. What's he saying to them? He's saying, you have to enter into the story as well. In the exact same way that I've entered into the story, he tells them, you're going to need to suffer too for the gospel. And so that's the challenge for all of us. How can we enter into the story of the gospel through the way we're living? It's, the churchianity story that we've talked about for the last few weeks when we're actually assembling together is not actually the gospel story. The gospel story is a complete transformation of our lives so that we are transformed into the image of Christ. And that's what Paul's encouraging them to be and to continue to be, not only individually, but also as a church. He's not just talking to individual people. He's saying, as a church, let your manner of life as a community be worthy of the gospel of Christ. I think that would be a good question for us to ask ourselves as New Tampa Church. Are we embodying the story of Jesus in the way that Paul is? Is the gospel really washing over us as a church? And then just the last thing that stood out to me in this is that the gospel is the pronouncement of things to come. Really famous verse here in verse 21 when Paul says, he's kind of wrestling with this idea of what's going to happen to me. And he says, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. The only reason that Paul is able to say to die is gain is because the gospel has transformed his life, and he believes that the gospel is a pronouncement of things to come. And he says, he says, if I were to die, I would be with Christ, and there's a sense in which that would be far better. And so this is one of the, just really 2 or maybe 3 times in the Bible that we see any hint about what might happen to us immediately after we die. Paul seems to think, he's like, if I die, I'll be with Christ. And so it seems to indicate, my mind went to one of the thieves on the cross when Jesus says to him, today you will be with me in paradise. The thief who confesses him. Jesus says, today you will be with me in paradise. So you get this idea that there is a period of time in which after death, we will be comforted by Christ. I don't want to read too much into that, but that seems to be kind of what Paul's saying. I want to be with Christ, and if I die, I'll be with Christ. But the ultimate goal, and we're going to get to this at the end of Philippians 3, I know I talk about this a lot, but I think what the church misses sometimes is that is not the end of the story. Okay, so the end of the story is resurrection. And that is what we are celebrating with Easter. The New Testament consistently refers to Jesus as the first fruits, right? Like first fruits. That's what a farmer looks at. His first fruits are going to give him an indication of what is to come. What is the rest of this season going to be like? What are my crops going to be like this year or this season? And so the New Testament says that when Jesus died and when he rose from the dead, he is the first fruits of things to come. The gospel is the pronouncement of things to come. So Christians today, and you can read the end of Philippians 3 and see this. Christians today look at that story and they say, oh, Christ is the first fruits. I'm also going to participate in this resurrection. It's really powerful to me that when Jesus is raised from the dead and he's with his apostles, if you remember, the first thing that the apostles say when they see him is, are you a spirit? Are you a ghost? And Jesus' answer to them is, no, I'm not a ghost. In fact, he says, look, it's my body. Here are the scars on my hands and my feet and my side. And then he says, I'm really hungry. Do you have anything to eat? And they give him a piece of fish. The point that the Western contemporary church misses a lot, not necessarily the church historically, but the point that we miss a lot is that we're supposed to look at that and say, oh, that is the first fruits of things to come. The story of resurrection, like that's where this whole thing is headed. And that's why Paul is able to be so, that's why Paul is able to have the disposition that he has towards death. That's why he's able to say, for me, to die is gain. Because he ultimately believes in the story of resurrection. He believes that the gospel is a pronouncement of things to come. And so it's been powerful to me just to read through some of the things that Paul has to say about the gospel. And I hope you're encouraged by that, especially this week as we're all kind of thinking about the significance of resurrection and the story of the Bible and the story of our lives. Next week, we're going to get into Philippians 2, which is incredibly powerful and convicting, and I'm really excited about studying that this week and talking about it. Hopefully it's helpful to you too. I'm going to get out on GroupMe tonight. I'll get out the discussion questions for this text, and also I'll just send you the reading as well, just so you know what that is if you want to read it again by yourself or with your family. Hope everybody's doing okay. Miss y'all. Talk to you soon.